In the autumn of 1896, the Harlow family made a decision that would forever alter the course of their lives and shake the very foundations of their small Vermont community. Armed with lanterns, shovels, and a court order that had taken months to obtain, they gathered at the edge of the old cemetery on a moonless October night to exhume the graves of their own ancestors. What they discovered beneath the cold New England soil was not simply the remains of the departed, but a secret so profound and disturbing that it had been deliberately hidden for nearly half a century. This is the story of what happened when the past refused to remain buried, and when one family's quest for truth tore apart everything they believed about themselves. The Harlow name carried considerable weight in Middlebury, Vermont, a prosperous town nestled in the Champlain Valley, where the Green Mountains rose like ancient sentinels to the east and the fertile farmland stretched toward Lake Champlain in the west. For 3 generations, the Harlows had been pillars of the community, respected merchants and landowners whose general store on Main Street had served the town since 1847. The family had built their fortune through hard work, shrewd business sense, and an impeccable reputation for honesty that made their name synonymous with integrity throughout Addison County. Thomas Harlow, at 42 years of age, stood as the current patriarch of the family. He had inherited the general store from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. Thomas was a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and the calloused hands of someone who had worked every day of his life. He had married Catherine Brennan 20 years earlier, and together they had raised 4 children in the large white house on Court Street that had belonged to the Harlow family since 1850. Their eldest son, William, had just turned 19 and was studying law at Middlebury College. Their daughter, Elizabeth, 17 years old, helped her mother with the household and served as a teacher at the local schoolhouse. The younger children, twins Samuel and Margaret, were 14 and still attending school. The trouble began in June of 1896, when Thomas received a letter from a lawyer in Boston. The envelope was made of expensive cream-colored paper, and the return address bore the name of a prestigious law firm on Beacon Street. Thomas opened it in his office at the back of the store, surrounded by ledgers and account books, and read it 3 times before he understood what it was saying. The letter informed him that a woman named Abigail Winters had died in Boston 2 months earlier, and that her last will and testament contained information that directly concerned the Harlow family of Middlebury, Vermont. The lawyer requested that Thomas come to Boston at his earliest convenience to discuss matters of great importance regarding his family history. Thomas showed the letter to Catherine that evening after the children had gone to bed. They sat in the parlor, the gas lamps casting shadows on the floral wallpaper, and Catherine read the letter with growing concern. She looked up at her husband with questions in her eyes. But Thomas had no answers. He had never heard of Abigail Winters. The name meant nothing to him, and he could not imagine what connection this Boston woman could possibly have to his family. But the lawyer's letter was insistent and formal, and it spoke of matters that required immediate attention. Thomas decided he would travel to Boston the following week. He made the journey on the Rutland Railroad, departing from Middlebury on a Monday morning in late June. The train carried him south through the Vermont countryside, past farms and forests, through small towns and river valleys, until it reached the bustling streets of Boston late that afternoon. Thomas had been to Boston only twice before in his life, and the city always overwhelmed him with its noise and crowds and endless motion. He found his way to the law office on Beacon Street, where a secretary showed him into a wood-paneled conference room overlooking the common. The lawyer who greeted him was a thin, precise man named Edward Morrison, who wore a perfectly tailored suit and gold-rimmed spectacles. Morrison shook Thomas's hand and gestured for him to sit in one of the leather chairs around the mahogany table. Then, without preamble, Morrison opened a leather portfolio and began to speak. What he said in the next hour would change everything Thomas believed about his family, his heritage, and his very identity. Edward Morrison began by explaining that Abigail Winters had been a woman of considerable means, living in a modest but comfortable home in the south end of Boston for the past 45 years. She had never married, had no children, and had lived a quiet, unremarkable life as far as most of her neighbors knew. She had supported herself through investments and rental properties, attending church regularly, and keeping to herself. When she died at the age of 73, Her will revealed something that shocked even Morrison, who had been practicing law for 30 years and thought he had seen everything. Abigail Winters had left detailed instructions that upon her death certain documents in her possession were to be delivered to Thomas Harlow of Middlebury, Vermont. These documents, Morrison explained, concerned Thomas's grandfather, Jonathan Harlow, who had founded the family store in Middlebury and who had died in 1863 during the Civil War. Thomas leaned forward in his chair, his heart beginning to pound. His grandfather had been a hero, everyone said so. Jonathan Harlow had enlisted in the Vermont Brigade at the age of 47 and had died at Gettysburg, fighting for the Union cause. His name was inscribed on the monument in the town square. Morrison slid a yellowed envelope across the table. It was sealed with red wax, and written on the front in faded ink were the words, "To be opened only by a direct descendant of Jonathan Harlow." Thomas stared at the envelope for a long moment, before picking it up with trembling hands. He broke the seal and extracted several sheets of paper covered in elegant handwriting. As he read, the color drained from his face. The letter was from Abigail Winters herself, written just weeks before her death. In it she revealed that she was the daughter of Jonathan Harlow, born in 1823 in Middlebury, Vermont. She had been given up as an infant to a family in Boston, raised under a different name, and had lived her entire life knowing that her father was alive but had abandoned her. The documents included baptismal records, a birth certificate, and letters written by Jonathan Harlow himself, acknowledging his daughter, but refusing to claim her publicly because of the scandal it would cause. Thomas read through the papers in stunned silence. According to the documents, his grandfather had fathered a child with a young woman named Sarah Brennan when he was only 18 years old. Sarah had been a servant in his family's household, an Irish immigrant who had nowhere to turn when she found herself with child. Jonathan's parents had arranged for the baby to be sent to Boston, had paid the Winters family to take the child, and had sworn Sarah to secrecy. Shortly after, Sarah had disappeared from Middlebury, and no one had heard from her again. Jonathan had gone on to marry Rebecca Thompson, to found his successful business, to become a respected citizen, and eventually a war hero. But he had carried the secret of his abandoned daughter for his entire life. Morrison produced more documents from his portfolio. There were letters between Jonathan Harlow and the Winters family, spanning decades. There were records of payments Jonathan had made to support his hidden daughter, always through intermediaries, always in secret. And there was a final letter written by Jonathan in 1862, just before he left for the war. In it, he expressed his deep regret for having abandoned Abigail, his hope that she had lived a good life, and his fear that he would die without ever making amends for what he had done. He had died at Gettysburg, and Abigail had kept his letters all these years, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. Thomas sat in the conference room as afternoon turned to evening, reading and rereading the documents, trying to make sense of what he was learning. His grandfather, the man he had been taught to revere, had lived a lie. The Harlow family history was built on a foundation of secrets and shame. And now, decades later, the truth was demanding to be acknowledged. Morrison explained that according to Vermont law, Abigail Winters had been legally entitled to a share of Jonathan Harlow's estate. But she had never claimed it. Instead, she had waited until her death to reveal her existence, and now she was asking that the truth be known, that her name be added to the family records, and that she be recognized as what she truly was, a Harlow. Thomas left Boston the next day in a state of profound shock. The train carried him back through the green hills of Vermont, but he saw none of the scenery. His mind was consumed with questions and implications. What would this mean for his family? How could he tell his wife, his children, his community, that everything they believed about Jonathan Harlow was a carefully constructed fiction? When Thomas returned to Middlebury, he could not bring himself to speak of what he had learned. He went through the motions of his daily life, opening the store each morning, greeting customers, tallying accounts, but his mind was elsewhere. Catherine noticed the change in him immediately. Her husband had always been steady, reliable, a man of few words but consistent action. Now he seemed distant, troubled, lost in thoughts he would not share. She asked him what had happened in Boston, what the lawyer had told him, but Thomas only shook his head and said it was a complicated legal matter that would take time to sort out. Days passed, then weeks. Thomas kept the documents locked in his desk at the store, taking them out late at night when everyone else had gone home, reading them again and again as if repeated examination might change their contents. He began to have difficulty sleeping. He would lie awake in the dark, listening to Catherine's quiet breathing beside him, and think about his grandfather. What kind of man abandons his own child? What kind of man builds a life on such a foundation of deception? And what kind of man, Thomas wondered with growing horror, keeps such knowledge to himself? In mid-July, Thomas made a decision. He would travel to the old cemetery where his grandfather was buried and spend time at the grave, hoping that proximity to Jonathan's resting place might bring him some clarity, some sense of what he should do. The cemetery lay at the edge of town, on a hillside overlooking the valley. It was a peaceful place, shaded by old maples and surrounded by a stone wall. Jonathan Harlow's grave was in the family plot, marked by an impressive granite monument that listed his dates of birth and death and the single word, hero. Thomas stood before the grave for a long time, hat in hand, feeling the summer sun on his shoulders. He thought about the man buried beneath his feet. Jonathan had been 40 when Thomas was born, and had died when Thomas was only 9 years old. Thomas's memories of his grandfather were fragmentary: a deep voice, large hands, the smell of pipe tobacco. He remembered being lifted onto his grandfather's shoulders, remembered feeling safe and proud to be a Harlow. But now those memories felt tainted, unreliable. Who had Jonathan Harlow really been? And how much of the man Thomas remembered was real? And how much was the carefully maintained fiction the family had created? As Thomas stood there, lost in thought, he became aware of another presence in the cemetery. An elderly woman was making her way slowly up the hill, leaning heavily on a walking stick. She was dressed in black, her face lined with age, her white hair pulled back in a severe bun. She stopped a few feet away from Thomas and regarded him with sharp, intelligent eyes. Thomas nodded politely, assuming she had come to visit her own family's graves, but the woman did not move on. Instead, she continued to stare at him with an expression that was difficult to read. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was thin but clear, with the accent of someone who had been born in Vermont but had lived elsewhere for many years. She asked if he was Thomas Harlow, and when he confirmed that he was, she nodded slowly, as if something had been confirmed. She introduced herself as Margaret Brennan, and the name sent a shock through Thomas's system. Brennan. Sarah Brennan had been the name of the young woman his grandfather had gotten with child all those years ago. Catherine's maiden name was also Brennan. Could there be a connection? Margaret Brennan explained that she had traveled from Burlington specifically to find Thomas. She had learned of Abigail Winters's death through a notice in the Boston newspapers, and she had come to Middlebury because she had information that the Harlow family needed to hear. She was, she said, the granddaughter of Sarah Brennan. Her grandmother had not disappeared after leaving Middlebury in 1823. She had gone to Burlington, had found work in a mill, had eventually married a man named Patrick O'Sullivan, and had lived until 1878, dying at the age of 73. Sarah had told her family the truth about what had happened to her, about Jonathan Harlow, about the baby who had been taken from her, and she had made her descendants promise that someday, somehow, the truth would be known. Thomas listened to Margaret Brennan's story with mounting disbelief, so there were others who knew the secret. The Brennan family in Burlington had carried the story down through the generations, and now, with Abigail Winters's death bringing the matter into the open, Margaret had decided it was time to speak. She told Thomas that there was more to the story than he knew, that the documents in Boston told only part of the truth. Sarah Brennan had not been a willing participant in what had happened. Jonathan Harlow had forced himself upon her. In modern terms, Thomas understood with sickening clarity his grandfather had committed rape. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. He stood in the cemetery, the summer afternoon, suddenly feeling cold, and tried to process what Margaret Brennan had just told him. His grandfather was not just a man who had abandoned his child. He was a man who had committed a violent crime against a vulnerable young woman. The heroic figure whose memory Thomas had honored his entire life was, in truth, a monster. Margaret Brennan watched Thomas's face as he absorbed this information, and her expression was not unkind, but it was firm. The truth, she said, had been buried long enough. She explained that Sarah Brennan had been only 16 years old when she came to work in the Harlow household in 1822. She had been an orphan, having lost both parents to illness, and had been grateful for the position, even though the work was hard and the pay was minimal. Jonathan Harlow had been 18, the eldest son of a prosperous family, handsome and charming, and accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. He had pursued Sarah relentlessly, and when she refused his advances, he had forced himself upon her in the back room of the store late one night when his parents were away. When Sarah discovered she was with child, she went to Jonathan's mother hoping for help, but instead of sympathy, she found coldness and calculation. The Harlows could not allow their son's reputation to be damaged by such a scandal. They offered Sarah a choice: go away quietly, give up the baby, accept a small payment for her silence, or be turned out onto the street with nothing and no references that would allow her to find work elsewhere. Sarah had chosen survival. She had gone to Boston with the baby, had handed over her daughter to the Winters family, and had taken the money the Harlows gave her. But she had never forgiven Jonathan Harlow or his family for what they had done to her. She had returned to Vermont, to Burlington, rather than Middlebury, and had built a new life. She had married a good man who knew her history and accepted her anyway. She had raised 3 children of her own, and had told them the truth about their half-sister in Boston and about the family that had wronged her. And she had made them promise that someday, when the time was right, the Harlow family would be held accountable for what they had done. Thomas felt the world tilting beneath his feet. He asked Margaret Brennan why she was telling him this now, why she had waited so long. Margaret replied that she had not waited. Her family had tried to speak out before, but the Harlows were powerful and respected, and the Brennans were just poor Irish immigrants. No one had been willing to listen. But now, with Abigail Winters's will bringing the matter into the legal system, there was an opportunity to force the truth into the open. Margaret had come to Middlebury to tell Thomas directly, person to person, before she went to the newspapers and the courts. She wanted to give him a chance to do the right thing, to acknowledge the truth publicly, and make amends for the wrongs his grandfather had committed. Thomas stood in silence, his mind racing. The implications of what Margaret was proposing were staggering. If this story became public, it would destroy the Harlow family's reputation. The business would suffer. His children would be shamed. Catherine would be humiliated. And yet, Thomas found himself thinking about Sarah Brennan, about Abigail Winters, about all the women who had suffered because of his grandfather's actions, and his family's determination to hide the truth. Did he have the right to continue the deception, even if telling the truth would cost him everything he had? He asked Margaret Brennan what she wanted from him. What would constitute making amends for something that had happened more than 70 years ago? Margaret's answer was simple but profound. She wanted the truth told. She wanted Abigail Winters's name added to the Harlow family records. She wanted Sarah Brennan's story acknowledged in the historical records of Middlebury, and she wanted the Harlow family to publicly apologize for what Jonathan Harlow had done. Nothing could undo the past, but truth and acknowledgement mattered. They mattered to the descendants of Sarah Brennan, and they should matter to the descendants of Jonathan Harlow. Thomas told Margaret he would need time to think, to speak with his family, to decide what to do. Margaret nodded and gave him an address in Burlington where she could be reached. Then she made her way back down the hill, leaving Thomas alone with his grandfather's grave and his own troubled thoughts. He remained in the cemetery until the sun began to set, standing before the monument that called Jonathan Harlow a hero, and wondering what truth really meant and what price he was willing to pay for it. Thomas spent the next 3 days in a state of anguish that he could not hide from his family. Catherine finally confronted him on the evening of the 3rd day, after the children had gone to bed, demanding to know what was troubling him so deeply. They sat together in the parlor, and Thomas found that he could no longer carry the burden alone. He told her everything. He showed her the documents from Boston. He recounted his conversation with Margaret Brennan in the cemetery, and he watched as his wife's face went through the same progression of emotions he had experienced: disbelief, shock, horror, and finally a kind of numb acceptance. Catherine was silent for a long time after Thomas finished speaking. She sat in her chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, staring out at the darkening street. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but steady. She said that the truth, no matter how painful, could not remain buried. She reminded Thomas of something he already knew but had been trying not to think about. Catherine herself was a Brennan. Her father had been Patrick Brennan, a cousin of Sarah Brennan who had come to Middlebury from Burlington in the 1850s. Catherine had grown up hearing whispered stories about Sarah, about some terrible thing that had happened to her in her youth, but the details had always been vague, and no one had wanted to discuss it. Now she understood. Sarah Brennan had been her father's cousin, which meant that Abigail Winters, the woman whose will had started all of this, was Catherine's distant relative. Thomas had not considered this connection, and it added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Catherine pointed out that this was not just about the Harlow family's reputation. It was about justice for women who had been wronged and then silenced. It was about truth and accountability. She told Thomas that she supported whatever decision he made, but she asked him to consider what kind of man he wanted to be and what kind of example he wanted to set for their children. Did he want to be like his grandfather, prioritizing reputation over righteousness, or did he want to break the cycle of secrecy and deception that had poisoned their family for 3 generations? Thomas made his decision that night. He would tell the truth. He would acknowledge Abigail Winters as a member of the Harlow family. He would see that Sarah Brennan's story was made public, and he would personally apologize to Margaret Brennan and any other descendants of Sarah who could be found. It would cost him dearly, he knew. The scandal would damage his business, would make his family the subject of gossip and condemnation throughout the county. But Catherine was right. The alternative was to perpetuate an injustice, and Thomas found he could not do that and still live with himself. The next morning, Thomas wrote to Margaret Brennan in Burlington, informing her of his decision. He asked for a meeting where they could discuss the best way to make the truth public. Margaret responded within a week, expressing both surprise and cautious approval. She suggested they meet in Middlebury with other members of the Brennan family who had an interest in seeing Sarah's story told. Thomas agreed, and arrangements were made for a gathering at Thomas's home on the following Saturday. Thomas also decided he needed to inform his children before the news became public. He gathered William, Elizabeth, Samuel, and Margaret in the parlor one evening and told them the truth about their great-grandfather. The children's reactions varied. William, the eldest, was angry and wanted to know why they had to be the ones to suffer for something Jonathan Harlow had done 70 years ago. Elizabeth was quieter, more thoughtful, asking questions about what this would mean for the family going forward. The twins were confused and upset, struggling to understand why something that happened before they were born should matter now. Thomas tried to explain that truth mattered, that justice mattered, that doing the right thing was more important than protecting their reputation. He was not sure they understood, but he hoped that in time they would. The meeting with the Brennan family took place on a Saturday afternoon in August. Margaret Brennan came from Burlington, accompanied by 3 other descendants of Sarah Brennan, her sister Helen, her nephew Patrick, and her cousin Elizabeth. They sat in Thomas's parlor while Catherine served tea, and they talked for several hours about how to proceed. Margaret had brought documents of her own, letters Sarah had written to her family, records of her life in Burlington, a photograph taken late in her life showing a stern-faced woman with eyes that held both strength and sadness. Thomas looked at that photograph for a long time, thinking about everything this woman had endured. The group decided that the best course of action would be to present their evidence to the Middlebury Town Council and request that an official amendment be made to the historical records. They would also approach the local newspaper, the Middlebury Register, and ask them to publish a full account of what had happened to Sarah Brennan and what the Harlow family was now doing to make amends. It would be a public acknowledgement, impossible to ignore or forget. Thomas agreed to all of this, though his heart was heavy with the knowledge of what it would cost him. But there was one other matter that needed to be addressed, and it was Margaret Brennan who brought it up. She asked Thomas if he had considered what should be done about Jonathan Harlow's grave. The monument in the cemetery called him a hero, but that monument was based on a lie. Should it remain as it was, or should the truth be added to it somehow? And what about Abigail Winters? She had been buried in Boston, far from her father and the family that had rejected her. Should there be some acknowledgement of her in the Harlow family plot? Thomas had not thought about the graves, but now that Margaret raised the issue, he realized it was important. A monument was a statement about how a person should be remembered. Jonathan Harlow's monument made a statement that was false. But what could be done about it? He could not simply remove the word hero from the stone. That would require chiseling and would leave an obvious scar. He could add new text, but what would it say? Also a rapist? The very thought was absurd and horrible, yet to leave the monument unchanged seemed wrong as well. It was Catherine who proposed a solution. She suggested that they erect a new monument in the family plot, one dedicated to Sarah Brennan and Abigail Winters. It would tell their story in simple, direct language. It would stand near Jonathan's grave as a permanent reminder of the women he had wronged. And it would serve as a public acknowledgement that the Harlow family recognized what had been done and was committed to remembering the truth. The Brennan family members looked at each other, considering this proposal, and finally agreed that it was acceptable. But Margaret Brennan had one more condition. She said that if they were going to erect a new monument, if they were going to tell Sarah's story publicly, then they should do it right. They should have proof, undeniable evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. The documents were good, but documents could be forged or misinterpreted. What they needed, Margaret said, was physical evidence. They needed to exhume Jonathan Harlow's grave and the grave of his wife Rebecca. If there was anything buried with them, any personal effects or papers or items that might provide additional confirmation of the truth, those things should be found and preserved. And more than that, Margaret said, they should also locate Abigail Winters's remains in Boston and bring them back to Middlebury to be buried in the Harlow family plot, where she belonged by right of birth. The room fell silent. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Exhume his grandparents' graves? Dig up their remains after more than 30 years? It seemed ghoulish, sacrilegious, a violation of everything decent. And yet, he could see the logic of Margaret's argument. If they were going to make public claims about what Jonathan Harlow had done, they needed to be absolutely certain they were right. And if they were going to honor Abigail Winters, bringing her home to be buried with her family was a powerful symbolic gesture. William Harlow, who had been sitting quietly throughout the meeting, spoke up. He said that exhuming the graves was going too far, that it was disrespectful to the dead and would only make the scandal worse. But Elizabeth disagreed. She pointed out that Abigail Winters had been denied her rightful place in the family for her entire life. Bringing her home now was not disrespectful. It was an act of justice, however delayed. The twins said nothing, clearly overwhelmed by the whole situation, but Catherine supported Elizabeth's position. After a long discussion, Thomas agreed. They would petition the court for permission to exhume the graves. They would do it properly, with witnesses and official documentation, so that no one could later claim they had fabricated evidence or acted improperly. The legal process took months. Thomas had to hire lawyers, file formal petitions, and navigate the complex web of Vermont's laws regarding the disinterment of human remains. The court required testimony from multiple witnesses, proof of family relationship, and a detailed explanation of why the exhumation was necessary. There was opposition from some members of the community who thought the whole thing was morbid and unnecessary, and there were rumors and speculation that spread through Middlebury like wildfire. People stopped Thomas on the street to ask what was happening. Business at the store declined as some customers decided to take their trade elsewhere, unwilling to associate with a family embroiled in such a scandal. Finally, in late October, the court granted permission for the exhumation. The work was scheduled for a moonless night to minimize public spectacle, though word had spread and Thomas knew there would be onlookers. He hired a local undertaker named Samuel Perkins to oversee the actual digging, and he arranged for a physician, Dr. Henry Matthews, to be present to examine the remains and provide a medical report. Margaret Brennan and her relatives came from Burlington to witness the event, and Catherine insisted on being present as well, despite Thomas's objections that it was no place for a woman. Catherine reminded him firmly that this was as much her family's story as his, and she would not be excluded. On the night of October 23rd, 1896, Thomas Harlow stood at the edge of his grandfather's grave for the second time that year, but this time he was not alone, and he was not there to contemplate in silence. A group of perhaps 20 people had gathered in the cemetery, despite the late hour and the cold October wind that stripped the last leaves from the maple trees. Samuel Perkins and his assistants set up lanterns around the gravesite, casting pools of yellow light in the darkness. Dr. Matthews stood to one side with his medical bag, his face grave and professional. Margaret Brennan and the other Brennan descendants stood together, wrapped in heavy coats against the chill, and Catherine stood beside Thomas, her hand in his, lending him strength he desperately needed. Perkins and his men began to dig. The sound of shovels biting into earth was loud in the quiet night. Thomas watched, feeling increasingly sick as the pile of dirt grew beside the grave. It took more than 2 hours to reach the coffin, and when they did, Perkins called for everyone to move closer. The wooden coffin had deteriorated significantly in the 33 years since Jonathan Harlow's burial. The lid was warped and partially rotted, and when Perkins carefully pried it open, it came apart in pieces. Dr. Matthews stepped forward with a lantern and peered inside. What remained of Jonathan Harlow was mostly bones and scraps of fabric from the burial suit. Dr. Matthews made notes, photographed what he could with the primitive camera equipment available in that era, and then began a careful examination of the coffin's contents. There was not much. The remains, some tarnished brass buttons, a pocket watch that had stopped long ago, and a small leather-bound book. Dr. Matthews lifted the book carefully. It was a journal, and though it was stained and damaged by moisture, much of the text was still legible. He handed it to Thomas. Thomas opened the journal with trembling hands. The pages were filled with his grandfather's handwriting, entries spanning from 1822 to 1862. As Thomas read by lantern light, with the assembled witnesses watching in silence, he found confirmation of everything Margaret Brennan had told him. Jonathan had written about Sarah Brennan, about what he had done to her, about his guilt and his fear of being exposed. He had written about the arrangement his parents made to send the baby away, about the payments he made over the years to support the daughter he could never acknowledge. And he had written about his decision to go to war, hoping that perhaps dying for a noble cause might somehow redeem him for what he had done in his youth. The journal was a confession, written by a man who could not bring himself to speak the truth aloud, but who needed to record it nonetheless. Thomas closed the journal and looked at Margaret Brennan. There were tears on her face, but her expression was one of vindication. Here was the proof, undeniable and in Jonathan Harlow's own hand. Thomas handed the journal to Dr. Matthews, who documented its existence in his official report. Then they turned to Rebecca Harlow's grave, which was beside her husband's. That exhumation went more quickly, but it yielded nothing of significance beyond the expected remains. Rebecca had either known nothing of her husband's secrets, or she had taken any knowledge she had to her grave without recording it. With the exhumations complete, Thomas arranged for Jonathan and Rebecca to be reburied while he dealt with the other matter Margaret Brennan had requested. He traveled to Boston with Margaret and arranged for Abigail Winters to be disinterred from her grave in the South End. The Boston authorities were more cooperative than Thomas had expected, perhaps because the matter had been so thoroughly documented in Vermont. Abigail's remains were placed in a sealed coffin and transported by train to Middlebury. On a cold November morning, she was buried in the Harlow family plot, finally brought home after a lifetime of exile. A temporary marker was placed on her grave, while a permanent monument was prepared. The full story was published in the Middlebury Register in early December of 1896. The newspaper devoted 3 full pages to the account, including excerpts from Jonathan Harlow's journal, testimony from the Brennan family, and a statement from Thomas Harlow, acknowledging the truth and apologizing on behalf of his family. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some people praised Thomas for his courage in bringing the truth to light. They said he had done the right thing, that honesty and justice were more important than reputation, and that the Harlow family should be commended for making amends for past wrongs. But others were furious. They accused Thomas of betraying his grandfather's memory, of bringing shame upon a respected family for no good reason, and of airing dirty laundry that should have remained buried. Several long-time customers of the Harlow store announced they would take their business elsewhere. Thomas received anonymous letters calling him a traitor and worse. The controversy raged through the winter of 1896 and into the spring of 1897. The town council debated whether to officially amend the historical records, with some members arguing that it was inappropriate to judge people of the past by modern standards, while others insisted that the truth should be recorded regardless of how uncomfortable it made people. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The records would be amended to include Sarah Brennan's story and Abigail Winters's existence, but Jonathan Harlow's name would not be removed from the town's rolls of notable citizens. He had, after all, died fighting for the Union, and that counted for something, even if his earlier life had been deeply flawed. In the spring, the new monument was erected in the Harlow family plot. It was a simple stone, smaller than Jonathan's elaborate marker, but its message was clear. It read, "In memory of Sarah Brennan, 1806-1878, and her daughter Abigail Winters, 1823-1896. Their voices were silenced, but their truth endures. May we remember them with justice and honor." Thomas stood before that monument on the day it was dedicated, with Catherine beside him and his children around him, and he felt something like peace. He had lost customers, had lost standing in the community, had lost the comfortable certainty of believing his family's carefully maintained history. But he had gained something more important, the knowledge that he had chosen truth over convenience and justice over reputation. The Harlow store survived the scandal, though it took years to fully recover. William eventually took over the business and ran it with the same honesty and integrity his father had shown, though he never quite forgave Thomas for what he viewed as an unnecessary sacrifice of the family's good name. Elizabeth became a teacher and later an advocate for women's rights, inspired by Sarah Brennan's story, and determined that no woman should ever again be silenced the way Sarah had been. The twins went on to live quiet, ordinary lives, forever marked by the knowledge that their family history was more complicated than they had ever imagined. Thomas Harlow lived until 1922, long enough to see the world change in ways he could never have anticipated. He saw the turn of the century, saw automobiles replace horses, saw electric lights come to Middlebury, saw women gain the right to vote. But he never regretted his decision to exhume his grandfather's grave and bring the truth to light. In his final years, he would sometimes walk to the cemetery on quiet afternoons and stand before the monuments, the old one that called Jonathan a hero, and the new one that remembered the women he had wronged. Both were true, Thomas thought. Jonathan had been a hero and a villain, had done both great good and terrible evil. That was the complexity of human nature, the reality that simple monuments and simple stories could never quite capture. The story of what the Harlow family did in 1896 became a part of Middlebury's history, passed down through generations. It became a reminder that truth matters, that justice delayed is better than justice denied, and that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is to acknowledge the sins of the past rather than hide them. The graves remain in the cemetery to this day, silent witnesses to a story of wrongdoing and redemption, of secrets buried and finally brought to light. And the two monuments stand side by side telling their different truths, reminding anyone who stops to read them that history is never simple, and that the past, once disturbed, never quite settles back into place the same way again. This is what happened after the Harlow family dug up their own ancestors. They discovered that truth, once unearthed, cannot be reburied. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.